All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on the North Carolina oyster boom. I'm excited to be here with y'all. I'm Mike Leffler, the new Deputy Director for the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. We're happy to partner with the Maritime Museum to offer 4 presentations on the history of different fisheries in our state to celebrate the 200 years of state marine fisheries management and conservation in North Carolina. This is the first of 4 presentations. We wanted to start with oysters, as it was this fishery that caused lawmakers in Raleigh to sit up and pay attention to what was going on in fisheries along the coast of North Carolina. On December 30th, 1822, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a law titled "An Act to Prevent the Destruction of Oysters and for Other Purposes in the State." This law restricted oyster harvest gear and prohibited the export of North Carolina oysters to other states. It was the first statewide law governing marine fisheries, and we're excited to celebrate that milestone here in North Carolina. Of course, at that time, there was no State Marine Fisheries Commission. There was no Division of Marine Fisheries. There wasn't even a Marine Patrol to enforce this law, but it was the beginning of a series of laws enacted over decades that would eventually establish all of these things. Today, David Bennett will talk about a big part of that history with all of you today. We also have staff from the Division of Marine Fisheries with us this morning here in the front row. They're going to be here afterwards to answer questions and to discuss oysters as they are today here in North Carolina. So David is the curator of maritime history for the Maritime Museum System. He holds a bachelor's in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a master's in maritime history from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. His research interests focus on North Carolina's commercial fishing industry, as well as traditional workboats. Bennett also oversees the Maritime Museum's Harvey W. Smith Watercraft Center. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Bennett.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here today with y'all, and thank you to everyone who's logged in online. And so this presentation is on North Carolina's oyster boom. It's primarily going to focus on the late 19th century when the oyster industry was a really big business in the state of North Carolina. And unfortunately, it's also the same period in which the oyster industry pretty much crashes. And our oyster industry has never been the same since in this state. This is basically a broad overview. I'll primarily be talking about tonging, dredging for oysters, the rise of packhouses, canneries, that sort of thing in North Carolina. If you're more interested in things like the history of oyster farming in North Carolina, I did a presentation on it back in January. That's available on YouTube. You can watch that to learn more specifically about that. And next week, next Thursday on the March 23rd at 11 o'clock, I'm going to be doing a program entitled The Oyster Patrol Early Enforcement of North Carolina's Oyster Laws, which is primarily about the Second Shellfish Commission. But let's just kind of delve into this presentation. But before we do, I'd like to give a sort of brief shout out to H2O Captain, who sponsored the live stream for the folks online. All right, so in the United States, the oyster industry was really expanding in the years following the Civil War. There had been a strong industry in the northern states and in the Chesapeake prior to the Civil War, but things really kind of take off afterwards because you have expansion of railroad networks, you have more canals being developed in the United States, so more oysters can be moved by steamboat. There's steam canning, so you have the hermetic sealing of oysters in cans, which really kind of takes off during the Civil War. And so you're able to ship oysters farther and farther west and even to Europe. And you just have a rising middle class and a prosperous post-war economy. And so more people can afford more expensive seafoods than they had before. And the oyster became pretty much the most valuable seafood in the United States from the end of the Civil War all the way up to World War I. And so as was mentioned, from 1822, it became illegal to export oysters from the state of North Carolina. And it was pretty much that way up until 1872. So about 50 years. We couldn't really do a whole lot with oysters in the state, and there wasn't a huge domestic demand for it either. So you had a very fledgling industry, very nascent, by the early 1870s. But in 1872, North Carolina established a law that permitted had an oyster season and permitted the exportation of oysters. So the possibility for the industry really starts to, for its development, starts to open up in 1872. A rather significant figure is George N. Ives, who's this guy from Connecticut, from New Haven, Connecticut, who moved to Beaufort in 1874 to establish a wholesale fresh fish and oyster business. Eventually he relocated that business to New Bern, but he maintained branches in Moorhead and Beaufort. He's a really important figure because, one, he introduced the concept of shipping oysters on ice to North Carolina. Nobody was doing this prior to him. They were shipping fish on ice, but not shellfish. People were pickling oysters prior to him, or they were just only moving oysters in sort of wet burlap bags by boat in the wintertime, short distances, or moving them by cart over land. He's also noted for introducing the Sharpie to North Carolina in 1875. He wanted a fast, flat bottom watercraft that could maneuver through places like shallow waters like Core Sound with ease, carrying a large load of oysters. At the time, the locals here were using basically log boats, these sort of dugout multi-log boats called cunners, which were not fast, they were not efficient, they had deeper draft, and they weren't what he wanted. So he went back north, ordered two boats, the Lucia and Ella, and brought them down to North Carolina by schooner. They were unloaded at Washington and then sailed to Beaufort. And I've done presentations on the Sharpie in the past, and it's a fascinating story, its introduction, but it becomes a very important boat to the oyster industry, one of the backbones to the North Carolina oyster industry. But you have your first cannery in North Carolina in 1877 on Ocracoke Island. Most people have never heard about this one. It was owned by Maltby and Edwards, who were pretty prominent oyster dealers out of Norfolk and Baltimore. And it was a moderate-sized cannery, used modern canning technology, and employed about 30 to 40 people at that factory on Ocracoke. It's short-lived, but the newspapers at the time were declaring it a harbinger of more and greater enterprises to come to North Carolina, which was the truth. Because in 1885, you have a company called Moore and Brady, another Baltimore-based oyster and fruit cannery, comes to New Bern, and this is the first really successful cannery that opens up in North Carolina, right on the Trent River in downtown New Bern, close to where like the Tryon Palace area is today. Then 1885 to 1886, or actually going a little bit later than that, you have this oyster survey that takes place. So in 1885, there's a resolution that's passed by the legislature saying we really want to see the oyster industry in Eastern North Carolina take off, so there can be more economic development, more opportunities, because as we mentioned earlier, it's a huge industry, particularly for the Chesapeake Bay. And the industry in the Chesapeake is contracting due to overfishing. So there's a lot of possibility. And so the state also really wants to promote the idea of oyster farming. In order to do that, they need to map out all the oyster beds, or most of them, in North Carolina. And so they get this guy, Lieutenant Francis Winslow, U.S. Navy, to do that. He had worked with the U.S. Geodetic Survey and had surveyed oyster bottom in parts of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, and it was a huge success there. And so North Carolina was wanting to sort of see a repeat of that in our waters. And so here's an example of one of the maps that he created. And so all these sort of this red or pinkish area here, those are oyster reefs. And then these boxes around them, those are sort of the legal limits around them. Those are the law saying that these are where we're defining as being where these beds are. Where there's not these boxes, you can have things like oyster farms around them. And so in 1887, the state starts to revise its laws. I'm not going through all the oyster laws, but just some really important ones. You have the expansion of private ownership of small plots of bottom for oyster culture. Oyster culture had been around in North Carolina since the 1840s, but had not really taken off. It was not particularly popular because there wasn't a whole lot of, state had been pushing it, and there hadn't been a whole lot of legal protections on private ownership. And it permitted the use of oyster dredges on public beds, which had been banned since 1822 in North Carolina. So you're allowing dredges basically for the first time in decades. Then 1887, you have your first Shellfish Commission is established. They took Winslow's maps where he plotted out all those oyster beds and said they basically defined what the legal limits on those beds were. And then they said, then they were then helping set up oyster farms until about 1889. So basically they were supposed to promote the industry and kind of get it up on its feet. So prior to 1887, the oyster industry is almost entirely confined to New Bern, Beaufort, and the New River area of North Carolina. But after that, then things really start to expand throughout Eastern North Carolina, particularly in Pamlico Sound. And so in 1888, you really start to see this oyster boom develop because you have Winslow's surveys are published. So not only are people really establishing large oyster farms in 1888, but these maps are publicly available. So anyone who might want to go out and dredge or tong on these beds can also know exactly where they're all located. At the same time, there's a there's a nationwide oyster crisis, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay and with the northern states like Long Island Sound, where there's this decline in northern beds because of overfishing, a decline in the Chesapeake Bay because of overfishing. And then the North Carolina oyster beds are largely untouched. And so everyone starts eyeing North Carolina after Winslow's studies have been published. In 1889, you start to see out of state, the oyster survey is really put out there, published. There's a big report that includes maps with it that's put out there by the state of North Carolina. And you've got oystermen from Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, all start flocking into the state with their dredge boats and buy boats as well. And they're bringing improved tongs, improved metal tongs, and larger dredges to North Carolina. And actually, a lot of these implements are first popping up in New Bern with that early cannery that was established in 1885. And so 1889, the first Shellfish Commission is disbanded because it's sort of like they've accomplished their task. they've got the oyster industry up on its feet. Things are starting to happen. Money's being made. Oyster farms are being established. Canneries are opening. But there's all these sort of interesting things that start to develop. So let's talk about the tongers in North Carolina, the people who are harvesting oysters with tongs. These are largely professional watermen. They're often involved in other fisheries like the shad and herring fisheries. Or they're small scale farmers who are farming in the off season. Their tools, their boats, their tongs, they're very cheap. And they're relying on their own labor. They work for themselves, for their families. It's all small private enterprise, and they have direct control over everything. When they work, how they use their money, how they spend it, etc. And these are tongs right here, these improved tongs. And then here's some of the types of boats these tongers would have been using, sort of these sort of log boats or shad boats. Sharpies. And this is sort of an early sort of type of Sharpie that you'd see in our local waters. And you've got this sort of catch rigged Sharpie here, but with mounds of oyster shells in the background and men with these derricks unloading the oysters from the boats. And then you've got these gaff rig Sharpies, or kind of schooner rigged Sharpies that developed. And so we'll talk about the dredging real quick. So this is sort of representative of this industrialized, organized labor that's being introduced into North Carolina. So your captain on your vessel might be the only professional waterman in the crew, and everyone else, the guys who are working the dredges, a lot of them are unskilled laborers, and they're just working for wages. And these dredges, these schooners, they're all expensive, and it's often necessitating the involvement of corporations. So these major canneries out of Baltimore and Norfolk might be a lot of times the primary owners of these vessels, or you might have groups of men in coastal communities who own these vessels. And here's the improved dredge. We have a dredge windlass here in the museum, and they're actually quite interesting. They're actually rather dangerous implements, because this right here, if you snag the dredge on an oyster reef or a rock and it doesn't come loose, the boat will keep going forward. That will stay in place, and then this handle will start. The dredge will start unwinding itself, and the handle would fly out of control and hit men in the chest or the head, and a lot of times they would die or be crippled. But this is basically how these dredges work. They're being towed behind the boats along the reefs, scooping them up. And this is a fleet, an oyster fleet out of Baltimore. So you have schooners and bug eyes and pungies and all sorts of vessels, native to the Chesapeake area. They're coming down to North Carolina. You have a skipjack. So skipjacks start coming into play in the in the 1890s. They start coming into North Carolina. Some North Carolinians adopt the vessel. You have your typical sort of oyster schooner here. It's being used. And then, so your oyster shuckers, the men and women who are working in the canneries, in the packhouses to process the oysters, it's poor working conditions. It's usually low light, dark, damp conditions, cold weather. There's no interior heating. It's low wages. You're paid based off how many oysters you can shuck a day. So a lot of people are only making about $1.25 a day. And then here's the implements, all the different knives and chisels for opening the oysters. And typically It's your smaller, your more marginalized communities, your poor Black and white workers. A lot of your white workers tend to been Eastern European immigrants who are being brought in from the slums of Baltimore to work in Eastern North Carolina during the oyster season. And typically you have both men and women working alongside of each other, which during this period was rather uncommon. So some of the big questions that North Carolina is confronted with during this period is whether to export. And this is the sort of struggle that the state has had with oysters. And so to export, North Carolina tongers, we're typically in favor of this because they're working directly with out-of-state buy boats, typically coming from the Chesapeake, and they're providing oysters, and they're being compensated well for the oysters that they're provided to the buy boats. And that these Chesapeake Bay dredgers, they're also in favor of exporting the oysters from North Carolina because they're making a lot of money doing it. But some people don't want to export oysters, and there's groups of North Carolina oystermen who are concerned because there's some people who just don't have direct access to these buy boats or to these canneries, packhouses, and they feel like they're starting to get edged out of the industry, and you actually start to see more and more of that as time passes. And then so there's also an even bigger concern is whether or not dredging should be allowed. Of course, all of the Chesapeake Bay dredge boats are like, sure, let's dredge up North Carolina. Let's get some oysters. And the North Carolina oystermen, they're starting to invest in their own dredge boats as well. And then you've got these oyster canneries and packhouses, mostly coming from Norfolk and Baltimore. Some of them are homegrown that are popping up in North Carolina, and also the cities of Eastern North Carolina. So Beaufort, Moorhead, New Bern, Washington, Elizabeth City, they're benefiting a lot from the oyster industry, from dredging. Even you have communities like Witt and Vandermeer and Sea Level, the area, that are getting their own canneries. Marshallburg had its own cannery. There's great benefits to dredging. The canneries need to have high volumes of oysters coming in to be profitable. But the people who are concerned about dredging are the North Carolina tongers, because, with these dredge boats, you can harvest a lot more oysters in a short amount of time. You don't need the dredgers. So those guys are getting edged out of the industry by these dredge boats. And then a lot of the locals are worried about conservation. They're worried about overfishing because they've seen what has happened to the Chesapeake Bay. They've seen what's happened to the northern oyster grounds, and they've all been pretty much depleted. And so also what you're struggling with is more of a social issue. You have this different values that are being introduced. You're having industrialization that's being introduced into Eastern North Carolina, something that hadn't really existed on a very large scale prior to this period. The Industrial Revolution is finally has finally arrived to Eastern North Carolina, and it's coming in conflict with these small town, rural, agrarian values. Who's really controlling production? You've got these out-of-state corporations that are now taking control of industry in Eastern North Carolina, and that's quite intimidating. So 1889, you have a new oyster law that's introduced, which has placed restrictions on non-residents from exporting oysters. So these dredge boats and buy boats from the, or not so much buy boats, but a lot of these dredge boats from the Chesapeake Bay, you have restrictions that are being placed on them taking oysters out of state. They're setting defined periods of time in which you can use a dredge, so shortened season. And they're allowing sheriffs from the counties to start to enforce these laws, and they're given a lot of latitude, but they're under-resourced at the time. And it's quite interesting because they were allowing these law enforcement officials from like Carteret County to go into like Hyde County waters and enforce the laws. And so there's this weird things going on. There's a lot of latitude that's being given because the state doesn't have an enforcement mechanism quite yet. So the canneries are establishing themselves during this period. Maryland and Virginia, as I've mentioned, they're dominating the oyster business in Eastern North Carolina, but they're providing a lot of jobs to people. And you're seeing more and more financial prosperity coming in to these local communities like Beaufort and Washington, Elizabeth City. So you're seeing enhanced development. I think it's something like Elizabeth City during this period saw like 30% growth in its population. So let's see, Beaufort and Morehead City. This is downtown Morehead. So basically where like a lot of our restaurants are today on the waterfront, it was all oyster packhouses and fish houses. You have C.T. Watson, Thomas Daniels, Daniel Bell, all these guys. These were the biggest fish dealers in Eastern North Carolina, and they're from Carteret and Craven County, and they're dominating things in the two counties. You have George Ives has a pack house where the port is today, right, or by the railroad line. And this is kind of what the waterfront would have looked like. And then here in Beaufort, you have a large oyster cannery, the North Carolina Packing Company, then New Bern. And so there's a lot of promotion that's being put into these communities. So there's this quote that says, "There is no town or city in the United States that presents greater facilities for handling, canning, and packing oysters than the city of New Bern. Locations are abundant and can be had at a mere nominal sum. Labor is also abundant and cheap. The oysters are sold at low rates and the supply is inexhaustible. The state of North Carolina and the communities of Eastern North Carolina are promoting themselves to bring in more outside business, more corporations." And New Bern actually does a lot of self-promotion. And this is what the sort of Trent River waterfront for New Bern looked like at the time where a lot of this was taking place. And then, as we mentioned, we have Moore and Brady, first successful cannery. And then you have the Greenbaum brothers, another sort of Baltimore company that had a large cannery in downtown New Bern. And then here, this is the main fish district in downtown New Bern, kind of over where they have the sort of I think the Doubletree Hotel or Tryon Palace area. And then this is what that fish district looked like. You've got all these boats. These are all Sharpies, and they all would have been carrying oysters. And then you have Washington. This is what the downtown waterfront area looked like during that period. And so you had H.M. McGrath and Company from Baltimore. J.S. Farron had a cannery. That's another Baltimore concern in downtown Washington. And then here's an ad. J.S. Farron, one cannery, is looking to hire 500 to 600 people to shuck oysters. You know, doesn't matter what race you are, as long as you're at least 12 years of age, and to expect $1 to $1.50 per day for your work, which was actually for the community considered pretty good. And there's a lot of talk in Washington. You've got this large sort of agricultural population that's working on the farms during the farm season. A lot of times during the colder months, there's not as much work for them to go around. So they have ready employment in the canneries. So now they have a year-round source of income, and they're talking about people actually being able to properly put shoes on their children's feet and provide them with to buy their school books and stuff to actually pay for their kids to be properly clothed and equipped for school. Then you have Belhaven. Belhaven, prior to like 1890, did not exist. The thing that created Belhaven was oysters and lumber and the extension of a railway connection. oysters and lumber. It's pretty much what created Belhaven. And this is what Belhaven would have looked like at their waterfront area. Canneries. And here's an, sort of a help wanted ad for Cox and Cox, one of the canneries in Belhaven. They're looking to buy as many oysters as they can. Doesn't matter the quantity. Elizabeth City had lots and lots of canneries and lots of packhouses. And it prospered a lot. They had 12 canneries and packhouses. And 34% of their population were employed in the oyster industry. And so you've got oyster houses right here on their waterfront, more oyster houses, more 3 oyster houses right here, fish house here. So yeah, there's a lot going on in these communities in Eastern North Carolina. So 1887, you have 100,000 bushels harvested, all by local oystermen from North Carolina. 1890, you've got close to 3 million bushels being harvested, but North Carolina oystermen are only responsible for less than 1 million. And so, as you can imagine, there's some tension that's starting to arise because of folks from out of state coming in and profiting a lot off of North Carolina oysters. So while there's economic prosperity with Maryland and Virginia sinking a lot of money into Eastern North Carolina, lots of jobs being created, and more people with more jobs are able to spend their money in the local stores. And so all the sort of adjacent businesses are benefiting from this. You've got more boat building. There's all kinds of things that are going on. But you have tensions that are flaring at the same time because you've got all these families or local tongers that have been working these beds for generations. They're being pushed out by the dredge boats. So think of like a lot of people, families from like Pamlico County and Hyde County, more rural areas of Eastern North Carolina. They're the ones that are, somewhat suffering from this arrangement. And so they're viewing these out-of-state dredge boats as trespassers. They're not welcome. And so they're calling these dredge boats pirates, oyster pirates. It's a term that's being borrowed from other states, from like the Chesapeake Bay and from the more northern states. These undesired dredge boats. So there's a lot of dredging that's going on illegally. There's a lot of illegal exportation of oysters in North Carolina. And it's because there isn't much of a patrol service. There isn't really much of an enforcement mechanism at the time. There is some patrol boats that are being employed, and a lot of it's local law enforcement. As I mentioned, that's being given wide latitude. They're allowed to go all over Eastern North Carolina to try and enforce the law, but it's not really panning out. And here's a great example of it not panning out. So in 1890, you had a shooting in downtown New Bern over this idea of corruption within the sort of law enforcement that's going on. So what was going on was the state thought, well, wouldn't it be great to post some people at Coin Jock on the Albemarle Chesapeake Canal, where most of the oyster boats are leaving North Carolina waters and going up into the Chesapeake Bay. Why don't we just inspect the boats, tax them there? That way we can, what little bit of enforcement we have available to us, we can focus it on those choke points, and also places like Ocracoke. But there's all these rumors going around that these enforcement officials were taking bribes from the oyster boats, and that they weren't excising taxes or not to the full extent they're supposed to be. So they hired a guy to go undercover, a guy from Washington, to go and investigate what was really going on. And he found that the rumors were true, that there were enforcement officials that were being paid off. And rather than just present his report to the state, which he did, he also published it in the newspaper in Washington, this huge expose, and he named names. And later on, he was in New Bern, and he ran into one of those guys that he had named in the report. And there's a bit of an altercation, and a gun was pulled, and a guy gets shot in the stomach. And so not really working out this whole informal system of enforcement. And here's what I mean when I was talking about coin jock. So here's Croatuck County, and you've got this canal, the Albemarle Chesapeake Canal, that links the Albemarle to the Chesapeake Bay, and you've got coin jock right here. And so it's a natural choke point where they can inspect these oysters that are leaving the state. So and then in 1891, you have all these wild rumors of oyster war in eastern North Carolina. People, these oystermen from the Chesapeake Bay are bringing cannons down and Winchester repeating rifles, and they're harassing North Carolina oystermen, or they're even murdering them. They're going to Stumpy Point and carrying off people's cattle, things like that. And word's getting back to the legislature in Raleigh, and people are actually believing it. You had this one petition from Hyde County goes to Governor Fowle, and they cited that the oyster tongers were being pushed out by Virginia and Maryland dredge boats, which was true, and that they're worried that their shad nets, their gill nets and pound nets were being run over and destroyed by dredge boats. And that was true as well. So those were legitimate concerns that were being presented to the governor. But in that same petition, they write this: there are now about 150 sail of Maryland dredge boats at work in the waters of Pamlico Sound. We're helpless in the presence of these armed dredge boats without the intervention of your excellency in our behalf. So they're saying these guys have got guns, and we're scared, and we're being harassed. Then there's another letter that's sent by Sam Whitehurst of Dare County to Harry Skinner. And Harry Skinner is a sort of up and coming member of the North Carolina legislature. He's kind of becoming popular on a national level. He's a Democrat. And he gets this letter that he passes on to the legislature. It says, but the Virginiamen are down here and have taken entire possession of all the oyster grounds. Their boats are much larger than those here. And when these are at work, the Virginians will run down upon them and tear them up. And when they try to retaliate, it is useless, for they are armed to the teeth with Winchester rifles, and some have 36-pound guns. So they have artillery with them. Wasn't true. But the legislature believed it. Then there's this another rumor that Metro Makeley, who was a representative in the North Carolina legislature, had been involved in a murder of someone going and dredging his oyster farm, which again wasn't true. The man was out of town when this happened. And he kind of shows up at the legislature, and everyone's freaking out. And so in response to all these rumors, the governor and the legislature decide to deploy the Pasquotank Rifles, which is sort of like a company of what we would today consider the North Carolina National Guard, to suppress the oyster pirates that in the Pamlico Sound. And so the North Carolina governor actually obtained a howitzer from the Virginia governor to use against Virginia watermen. And he rented a steamboat, and he armed a steamboat, and violence never erupted. Nothing, they go out and they patrol, and they inform all these dredgers from out of state that they need to leave. The laws are changing. This is a warning, etc. And apparently everyone's really polite about it and just goes home. And they go and they interview people in Eastern North Carolina about alleged murders and things like that. And people are like, we don't know what you're talking about. None of that has happened here. And so it's all a complete farce. but the states spent a lot of money to do this. So while right before they send the passport tank rifles out, the state legislature passes a new set of oyster laws, one that restricts the season to October to May. More significantly, they completely ban dredging on the public oyster grounds. They install a coal law, so they limit the size of oysters that are marketable in the state, and that oystermen had to apply for a license, or you had to, in order to get a license to Oyster, North Carolina, you had to prove 12-month residency. So these are considered to be pretty harsh for the time, especially this ban on dredging. And so, at the same time, this law also created a second shellfish commission. So you're going to have a chief shellfish commissioner. They're going to monitor the harvest and sale of oysters in the state. They're going to enforce the laws, and they're going to have their own patrol boat. And behind all this, behind these new laws, behind this new shellfish commissioner is Senator Lucas of Hyde County. And he's sort of this anti-monopoly, anti-dredging, pro-tonging. He's coming from Hyde County, where he's really worried about his constituents who are from this tonging community, who feel alienated by all this out-of-state business. And he's trying to champion their cause. And he's winds up being the guy who invents, sort of helps write the legislation that creates the second shellfish commission. And then he gets the governor to appoint him as the shellfish commissioner. And this is the boat. Once the state finally decides to buy a boat, they buy this one, the Lily. And the talk that I have next week, we'll talk a lot about this particular vessel. And then fall of 1891, there's all these allegations of an oyster combine. So the allegations are that all these canneries and packhouses are getting together and they're going to fix the prices of oysters, and if they're not successful, then they're all going to decide to leave the state and try to force the state's hand into changing the laws to being more permissive. In 1891 to 1892, there's only 3 canneries open in eastern North Carolina because of the ban on dredging, and because of some of the residency laws that are being enforced. And so I'm going to segue real quick and talk briefly about oyster farming, because it's really important. And it's really what the state really wanted to see. And it doesn't quite take off the way it's supposed to. If you want to learn more about it, you can go on YouTube and see my video from January. But let me just kind of give you an idea of what people are thinking about with oyster farming. Early on, 1876, before all this really is taking off, this oyster industry is with us. It is just in its infancy. A few thousand bushels planted by my friend George Ives of Beaufort will soon swell into millions, and every acre of oyster ground be worth not less than $1,000. Talk about your Nevada and Arizona gold mines. Why, sir, we have a big bonanza at our very doors, a mine that will return, if properly worked, untold gold. And this is what a lot of people in eastern North Carolina thought and believed. And this is also the legislature was really sort of enamored with this sort of narrative. And so in the late 1880s, around 1888, 1889, you see this sort of explosion in corporate oyster farming, not just individuals who can own up to 10 acres, but corporations with hundreds or even thousands of acres. And so here's a list of just a few of these companies that are active in the 1880s and 1890s. And so, and here's part of an oyster farm that's owned by the Pamlico Oyster Company right here behind Ocracoke. And here's the other part of their farm that's behind Portsmouth Island. And of course, these are naturally occurring oyster beds. And I mentioned earlier, Lieutenant Winslow being the guy who went out and mapped the oyster grounds of the state of North Carolina. Well, shortly after he completes that, he retires from the Navy, and he's hired to be the general manager of the Pamlico Oyster Company, which is a large corporate oyster farm that I just showed you their grounds behind Ocracoke. And they're dominated by investors from New York, New Jersey, and Asheville, North Carolina. The mountains of people in the mountains of North Carolina, up in Asheville, there's a sort of banking center at the time. They sunk a lot of money into oyster farming, a speculative investment. And they started off with nearly 1,700 acres to farm with in 1888. And you have this territorial dispute that arises in 1890 between, the Pamlico Oyster Company and the locals from Ocracoke. And the locals are concerned that the company has claimed some of their natural oyster grounds, and the company is also trying to hire a local oysterman, but they're not willing to pay them the rates that they want. And so they're bringing in labor from the mainland, and it's causing all sorts of angst with people from off coming in and oystering in waters that they considered to be sort of their inheritance. More of like a communal property rather than a strictly common property. And so you wind up having an armed standoff. The governor gets really anxious about the whole situation. And that's also sort of explained in my other lecture that I mentioned. But oyster kind of farming becomes threatened because of all these sort of potential abuses that arise. And there are abuses in Eastern North Carolina. And it's because Winslow's survey was not complete. Before he could properly finish his survey, the Navy recalled him. And so the state was left, like, well, we'll try and finish it. But they don't ever really resume it until 1891, after lots of problems start arising over claims on oyster farms. There's a lot of concern that naturally occurring oyster bed was being claimed to farm, which was illegal. And so where you began to see problems in September 1891, the chief oyster surveyor of the state of North Carolina, W.G. Lewis, was threatened, and his assistant surveyors were fired upon by locals in Vandermeer and Pamlico County. And a lot of this was in response to the Grant Island Oyster Company had in fact claimed naturally occurring oyster ground, and the state had missed it. And it was also a problem that Lucas, the chief oyster surveyor, was not terribly in favor of oyster farming, and may or may not have made some inflammatory speeches about corporate oyster farms to locals in Pamlico County, and may have incited this violence against his own employees accidentally. But anyways, so the governor has to stop the surveys. He says, we're not going to issue any more grants, any more licenses for oyster farms, and we've got to stop all the violence. Most of the violence in North Carolina with the oyster industry has more to do with oyster farms than it does with dredging or tonging, surprisingly. And so, again, December 1891, there's problems out in the New River area. You got 40 oystermen that go after the oyster surveyors out there because they're saying that these corporations, you've got several corporations that are very active in the New River area. They're claiming that they're taking up naturally occurring oyster beds. So state officials, again, being run off. And an example of one of those New River companies is New River Oyster Company, which is basically dominated by businessmen from Wilmington, and they were primarily farming in Stones Bay. So 1894, the Shellfish Commission, the state agency that was stood up to enforce the laws of the state, cannot enforce them. And it's because they have to operate solely off of tax revenue from the oyster industry. And so 1891, 1892, they've got over $12,000 in tax revenue. But 1893, 1894, they got less than $200. So they can't run their boat. They can hardly afford to pay their own employees. So the law goes unenforced. And North Carolina oystermen wind up becoming the most, egregious violators of the oyster laws. They start going out and dredging, with impunity. And so in 1891, 1894, just everything's just completely crippled with the industry. Canneries are closed. There's economic hardship has come to a lot of these communities in Eastern North Carolina that had seen an economic boost from a lot of these canneries and from oyster dredging. And I like this little quote from the Weekly Economist from Elizabeth City: "The R months have come, but the oyster factories have gone." And this other clipping where, they're talking about, hey, people used to talk about the oyster industry a lot. They used to talk about canneries and oyster pirates and oyster farming. And it's 1895 and no one's talking about the oyster industry anymore in Eastern North Carolina because there's not really much of one to speak of. And so the Shellfish Commission basically comes out and says, we need to bring dredging back. That's the only way we're going to have enough tax revenue to actually enforce the laws. And so 1895, the laws start to loosen up. Dredging is starting to come back. They have a dredging law for about 3 months for the season, and it's restricted to, it says no vessel over 25 tons or steam vessel of any kind of tonnage shall be allowed to use scoops or dredges in the waters of the state. And so 1897, you got your dredging seasons expanded, and so the harvest starts to come back in a meaningful way. And then from 1898, 1899 season, you've got another big boom, almost 2.5 million bushels. You have 115 dredge boats and 950 tong boats are operating. And then 1899 to 1900 season, you've got some problems start to emerge. For one thing, you have this massive hurricane that sweeps through Eastern North Carolina in August 1899, and it just churns up the sounds and dumps sand and sediment on top of the oyster beds. And so it just buries the naturally occurring oysters and kills them, and buries and destroys a lot of these large corporate oyster farms. And so while the harvest is still relatively high, it's starting to decrease. And some of the canneries are starting to see the writing on the wall, and some of them close up early. In early 1900s, the oyster catch is just up and down, and finally it just sort of crashes. And so we have this one quote to wrap things up here with this presentation from George Ives, this guy who had come to North Carolina to start this fresh oyster business in Beaufort, and had been this real proponent for the oyster industry in Eastern North Carolina, one of the most important figures. And he wrote in 1911, "When I started the business, we could get all the oysters we wanted in Coarse Sound. No finer oysters grew than those which could be found in Coarse Sound, New River, and Jarrett's Bay. But now they are all cleaned up, or else of such small size that they are not of much value." And that's pretty much it. And for decades after, the state of North Carolina has been trying to bring back oysters by dumping oyster shells out in the sounds, it's just not the same as it was in the 1890s when things were booming. So do y'all have questions about the history? I know it's kind of gone on for a bit. Yes, sir. When did they stop dredging completely? Oh, I'm trying to remember. Do y'all remember? Because they brought dredging back, and then it didn't go away. And then I know they started allowing people to dredge under motor power back in the 1930s. And then you still allow dredging? Okay.
But in like the Pamlico Sound area.
Okay. So in Pamlico Sound, you can still dredge. So it hasn't, yeah. Any other questions?
This is our cannery in Marshallburg.
The cannery in Marshallburg. No, I don't remember it off the top of my head. But I do know out towards like Witt and sea level, I know that you had like the Taylors. I want to say they had a cannery. I'm trying to remember, there's another family out there that had a cannery. But yeah, the Core Sound canneries were locally owned. And I'm not sure I do know there is the Riggin family from Crisfield, Maryland. They settled in Marshallburg for a time in the 1890s. They might have had a cannery there. They did wind up having a cannery in Charlotte, down in Brunswick County, and they also had one down in Swan Quarter. But that was a little bit late. That was towards the very end of the boom that they had those. Any other questions? Yes.
David, looking maybe 50 years later, 1950s, 1960s, oyster diseases were very heavy in Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay.
Mhm.
Basically wiped out the industry.
Yep.
Did that move into North Carolina? And if it did, what was the impact on the landings?
I haven't really gone that far. Most of my research goes from like the 19th century to the early 20th century. I'm kind of slowly moving my oyster research more in that direction. But in this period in which I'm talking about, there's a lot of discussion of parasites, like the oyster drill, which is a concern, and actually it caused some problems for some of the oyster farmers in the state.
There was also a disease incident that went through the 70s and 80s and 90s that completely stopped specifically. So that's also in our fishery management plan, that history that went through and had to help thermal sampling to look at disease aspects in the oyster populations in North Carolina, but in the more recent history in the last few decades. And that kind of ended, reduced down what, late 80s, early 90s, something like that. Well before most of us started here now, but it was detrimental in some areas. But journal and MDX and other oyster diseases do still persist. I think we have a hard time finding any oyster in our state waters that does not have at least journal. Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Williams. I'm from DMF. I'm a oyster biologist there. One of the most prevalent oyster diseases is called journal. It's caused by a protozoan parasite called Rickensis. And they live inside of the mantle tissue in the oyster. And it is extremely pervasive. And it spreads sort of like wildfire. It doesn't really affect the oysters very much until they become overloaded with it, and it is not harmful to people to ingest it, but you will be hard pressed, I think, to find an oyster anywhere in North American waters that does not have at least one of those protozoan individuals living inside.
Yes.
Question on Facebook.
Okay.
What is the history on the grant leases?
The King's Grant leases. Well, that would be. I'm not so familiar with the King's Grants on oysters. I do know there's King's Grants on whaling and porpoises and sturgeon from starting in the 17th century. I'm not so familiar with oysters, but that's colonial era. Isn't one I've studied as much. But I do know the state of North Carolina had been issuing grants, underwater grants in the 19th century for oyster farming. And an individual could have up to 10 acres. Corporations could have more, depending on what the state was willing to allow them to have. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Tom Mullen, compared with the shellfish lease coordinator for the Green Fisheries.
So there's that question about these grants, some of those written these grants still exist in the form of shelter franchises in the state.
Okay,
A lot of them, so the current shelter leases are capped at 10 acres individually, first and 50 acres. Some of the really old theme grants are 30, 50 acres of water. Current leases that we continue to fund today. And those are the future leases are on basically 5 years. That's going to be a lot of times in the deep with those. It's kind of here I can go back and kind of read the language of the ocean bottom, that's the between that heat was perpetuated through a family or the deep grasses.
okay. So for the person online who asked that, if someone from DMF said the King's Grant stuff still exists. And okay, you can come on and repeat that.
Hello, I'm Owen Mulvey McFerrin. I'm the shellfish lease coordinator for the Division of Marine Fisheries. Some of the original King's grants for oyster bottom that were granted in North Carolina still exist. They're called oyster franchises, and they're on basically private chunks of submerged land that were deeded to private citizens. Those oyster deeds could, range in size from very small to up to 30 to 40 acres in some cases. Current oyster leases at the state grants are capped at 10 acres for individual leases and up to 50 acres for an individual person or business. Some of those older, the King's deeds, the King's grants, it's interesting to go back and read the language that was used, the way that, some of the oyster bottoms and the oyster reefs were described, and how that would change as that deed was transferred either through a family or, to different parties.
And so were those like 17th, 18th century?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, some of them are really, really old.
Yep, still colonial history. And then the state did start doing their own kind of granting system in the 1840s and 50s, I think through private laws. And then in the 1880s, then you had a grant program. And then in 1915, I believe they got rid of the grant program and instituted the lease system. So now you're basically renting bottom from the state rather than having ownership. So any other questions? Yeah, that's going to be, yeah. So the comment was, it seems to be that the oyster industry is starting to grow with the farms. And I guess that pretty much is where we're seeing the growth, really, isn't it? The farms. Got people from DMF who might be able to answer that. Oh, yeah, sorry.
So the sales off of per aquaculture shellfish have surpassed wildlife as well. It's decline in the sales of aquaculture continue to increase. It looks like that's the way the industry is continuing to go as more and more people are interested in their purchasing on the farm facility. There's pretty shell, circle and half shell. They're going to make the growth. Both of the life effectively on the shell farm.
Yeah, so the people online who couldn't hear that, the discussion amongst the people in the audience is that the farm landings are exceeding the wild caught. And it's what's ironic about that is that the state from pretty much the mid 1880s wanted to have farming all along as being one of the big components of the industry. Based on how they designed the laws and the resolutions passed by the legislature, and it didn't really turn out that way. Is the dredging and tonging, there's more of a more immediate short-term return on that than there's farming, because with the farms they had to wait 2 to 3 years a lot of times before they had a marketable harvest. So any other sort of questions or comments? Well, if that's it, thank you all very much for coming out and hearing me talk about the oyster industry, and thank you for to people from the Division of Marine Fisheries for coming. One more thing.
I want to put in a plug. We are opening up our 5-year review of our fishery management plan for oysters. And this is going to be specifically to the wild harvest only, not the shellfish lease program that Mr. Owen had just discussed. And we would like to introduce people to that. There will be what's called a scoping period, probably in September. We don't have the exact dates and times, but we'll have locations where we can promote public interest and ideas on fishery management plan specific to the wild harvest. So as Abby and Joe, our co-leads, will be representing the Division of Marine Fisheries for that plan development, looking specifically at the subtidal regions in Pamlico Sound for the mechanical harvest areas, which is the dredges, as you indicated, sir. And also looking at our hand harvest areas that are all the state, where they're open to open because of no health risks. And so I just wanted to make sure, put that plug in, keep your ear to the ground for the fishery management plan development, and we'll probably be starting to talk with our Marine Fisheries Commission beginning in 2024 in much more detail. So if you have ideas or input you would like to look at online on our webpage for the fishery management plan, please look into it. Please support the scoping hearings and the public comments, as well as questionnaires on our website when those come up, probably in the fall. And so we thank you and hope that you have an interest in wild harvest here, because it's a very important fishery, as David has introduced here, and has a long history in this state. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a great day.